For me, this all started 2 years ago in Wyoming. Along with my dad and a good friend, I signed up for a climb of the Grand Teton, which felt like another type of tourism while we passed through Jackson Hole. I didn't intend for this side quest to go any further than that, but the mountains have a way of pulling you in. As you climb more, bigger peaks and more challenging routes call to you. It can get you into trouble, but when a hard ascent works out, you often discover you can take a lot more pain and difficulty than you imagined. That feeling of overcoming is incredibly gratifying and addictive. Summiting and descending the Grand made me feel like I passed a test of self, and I wanted more. On the descent, I walked next to a guide named Pete, and I asked him what mountains people go for after the Grand. "Ever heard of Denali?" he asked. "If you're serious about this stuff, that's what I'd set your sights on. Tallest peak in North America. It's a good idea to get some practice on glaciers beforehand, though. It's a different style of climb." As soon as I got home, I started mapping out a plan. The Cascades Range, which runs through Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, is where many climbers train up for Denali, myself included. While it's pretty much impossible to simulate the weather in Alaska in the lower 48, you can log a lot of time on glaciers there. I completed the Ingram Direct on Rainier, Hotlambolum on Shasta, the Easton Glacier of Baker, and the Sulphide Glacier route on Shucksen. In September, I signed up for the May 5th, 2024 West Buttress Denali expedition through RMI. You'll find a lot of debate online around the value or necessity of a guide on this mountain. Personally, it was an easy decision. Guided teams have higher summit success rates than unguided teams on Denali, mostly because they're equipped to make better decisions and they have experience with the conditions, which are some of the most notoriously brutal in the world. In the week before I left for Alaska, the summit temps were routinely -80 Fahrenheit with wind chill. But there are factors that steer even inexperienced climbers away from guide services. You don't know who's in your group or their abilities. You don't have control over many of the logistics or the pace. And you're not on equal footing with the guides since they're always calling the shots. It's just part of the deal. But the added safety margin that comes with a service outweighed all of this for me, especially for my first time in the range. I pieced gear together during the months leading up to the climb. A few days before, I laid it all out on the floor and inventoried it with a checklist many, many times. Most people end up with 2 very large duffels of gear and a backpack like me. If you're more efficient than I was, like some of my teammates, you can squeeze your backpack into a duffel and consolidate to 2. I had in excess of 100 pounds of gear and food, and I kept wondering how I was going to lug this all up on the climb. There's no such thing as a porter on Denali. I set off on the morning of May 4th. Salt Lake to Seattle to Anchorage. It felt like a homecoming. I was born in Anchorage on Elmendorf Air Force Base, where my dad flew fighters in the 90s. I kept thinking about how this climb, the biggest endeavor of my life to date, was taking me full circle, back to my roots. On the journey up to Talkeetna, we would pass Eagle River, the site of my parents' first house as a married couple. My dad would tell me stories about dogfight practice above Denali in his F-15. Sure enough, we'd later see the F-22s that replaced those squadrons doing the same thing. I stayed at the Lakefront Hotel so I could be close to the airport, where I'd rendezvous with the team for the first time the next day. The Lakefront immediately lets you know you're in Alaska, with a wide array of taxidermy and guns on display, and of course, float planes in the backyard. This seaplane base on Lake Hood is the largest in the world. At 1 p.m. the next day, I met the team at Baggage Carousel 1 back at the airport. We loaded our gear into the shuttle trailer and set off for Talkeetna, which is the traditional staging area for Denali climbs. After a pit stop in Wasilla for some last-minute groceries, we arrived at K2 Aviation and unloaded our gear into the hangar. The most common way of beginning the climb is to fly onto the Kahiltna Glacier. Our group stayed at the Swiss Alaska Inn, which is a wonderful family-owned operation down the road. The rooms are basic but comfortable. We grabbed food at Denali Brewing in town and then ventured over to the Susitna River to see if we could get a look at Denali. It was partially obscured in clouds, but you could still get a sense of its enormous scale compared to everything around it. The next morning dawned rainy, not a flying day. We walked back to the hangar at K2 to start organizing the group gear.
Really good for carrying like bulky items also. So a lot of group gear, like you'll see we'll have big pots and any things that...
We received a very short briefing from Alan, a climbing ranger with the Park Service. I was expecting a fire and brimstone speech about the dangers of Denali, but his message boiled down to, listen to your team lead. This made some sense, as Alan himself was trained by our lead guide, Mike Walter, prior to him joining the Park Service.
Just some things on our end,
The next morning, our third day in Talkeetna, the sky cleared of clouds. We were buzzing with optimism about our chances of flying onto the glacier. We had to wait a while for a signal from K2. The weather is squirrely. It can be beautiful in Talkeetna while blizzards rage at base camp on the Kahiltna. K2 tends to fly climbers onto the Kahiltna using de Havilland otters, which are turboprops that can carry an astonishing amount of weight and have the power to weave around the beautiful and treacherous terrain we were heading into. Our pilot gave us a quick briefing and let me sit in the co-pilot seat, which is equipped with its own rudder pedals and yoke. I resisted the urge to test them out.
It's best to keep it away from your mouth unless you want to talk so we don't hear you breathing. Makes sense?
After landing, which was remarkably gentle considering we touched down on a glacier using skis, we shuttled gear from the plane onto the hill next to the airstrip.
Okay, I'm going over to that orange flag.
When you look at it, then there's...
Mike decided we'd spend the night at base camp, so we stomped out a platform and pitched our tents. It was hot. I overheard some commotion as we were setting up and turned to see both Mount Crossan and the nearest face of Mount Hunter sliding at almost the same time. We settled into what would become the normal rhythms of camp life. You get to a new spot, you deploy the tents and cooking gear, and you build a latrine. We were very proud of our first multi-stall design, where we cordoned off the clean mountain can from the pee hole with sleds. But none of us was bold enough to actually use a stall while the other was occupied. Later in the tent, I settled into some Tolkien as we wound down for our first night. Little did I know at this point how routine this activity would become. As soon as we lost the sun, the temperature plummeted to something well into the negative.
Do have the
The next morning, we rigged the sleds for the single carry up the Kahiltna to ski hill camp at 7,800 feet. Base camp sits at 7,200 feet, so you're mostly traveling the 5.5 miles over rolling, gently rising terrain. It feels essentially flat most of the time. Tugging the sled uphill wasn't as bad as I expected. We arrived at Ski Hill, and I was very ready to throw the pack down and be done with the sled for the day. After probing the area for crevasses, we deployed camp and tucked into our first meal in the Hillberg.
But the things you guys can do to...
It's said that you camp your way up Denali, and the generally accepted modern formula for the West Buttress involves climbing the mountain nearly twice. Since you have so much gear and food, the trick is to push it up higher in chunks, and then return to your camp to sleep. So, these caching missions, like we ran up Ski Hill to about 9,800 feet, were part of the strategy. The cache holes are very deep, mostly to ensure neither ravens nor weather could get at our precious supplies.
This valley, this is the northeast fork of the Kahiltna, and it's affectionately known as the Valley of Death.
Mm-hmm.
The ridge that goes straight up from like the head of this, what looks like the head of this, that's called the West Rib.
Mm-hmm.
Goes up high. The skyline is the Cassine Ridge, right-hand skyline. If you look at coming down from the summit, going down towards Looker's left, where it rounds into like a camel's hump type of deal.
Mm-hmm.
And then it plateaus. Right where it plateaus is High Camp 17.
Okay.
And then below that, coming towards us, there's a big basin that's mostly obscured, but there's a big flat spot, that's 14 Camp.
So far, we were on schedule, and the weather was cooperating. On May 10th, we made our move toward 11,000-foot camp. which is the first camp that really feels like it's on Denali. The angle of the terrain kicks back and it finally looks like a climb. The day started nicely, but in classic fashion, it deteriorated when we hit a storm hugging the slopes up higher. We made it to about 9,400 feet, where Mike halted us and we pitched the tents. Over the next 2 days, we made it to 11,000 feet, dug in, and then retrieved our cache from down low. Watching the climbing rangers snag powdery lines on the face above camp made me badly wish I had my skis. After a rest day, we moved cache supplies to 13,500, just below the next major camp at 14,200. To get there, you scale Motorcycle Hill, which reveals the massive and striking father and son's wall. You then head up Squirrel Hill and cross the polo field below Windy Corner, an infamous spot renowned for gale force winds as the air funnels into the pass there. When we returned to 11,000-foot camp, I was in pretty good spirits. We were maintaining pretty much the ideal pace for a Denali itinerary. I began to wonder if we'd become blessed with a pattern similar to 2022, which saw sustained gorgeous weather for most of the summer and some record high summit rates. We rested the following day. On May 15th, we learned that a member of our party wanted to turn back to base camp. So we parked it again for the day while 2 of the guides ran him down the glacier. Another day in the tents. Back in the cook tent, we listened to the weather report for the following day. The winds were picking up. Sure enough, on May 16th, we parked it again at 11 camp. The wind was whipping. In other places where the ambient air temperature is not in the negative teens, you might just go for it. But this is not what you do on Denali, where the wind chill drives temps so low that you risk almost instant frostbite to any exposed flesh. My tent mate James and I call the state you drift into hibernation mode. You enter an uncanny zone between consciousness and sleep. On May 17th, I knew something good was happening when we saw the long train of Navy SEALs pulling out of camp in their matching winter combat uniforms. We'd spent 6 nights at 11,000 feet. But the wind had died. We got the signal from Mike that today was going to be a move day. My morale spiked immediately, and I played music out loud on my phone as we packed up our camp. But my pack was heavy, likely in the 80-plus pound range. I started to realize at this point how inefficiently I'd packed, mostly with food and layers I just didn't need. We climbed back up to the polo field, and while we were breaking there, my overloaded bag tumped over, and an entire group meal got loose from the top opening. Before I could react, it gained speed and skittered out of my reach and down the hill. The meal came to rest in the middle of a crevasse field far below us. It wasn't recoverable. I felt deeply ashamed. The guides told me to shake it off, but it shattered my good mood. We built camp at 14 and settled in. Over the next 3 days, we retrieved our cache from 13,500, and we rested, restlessly. We lived vicariously through the Park Service as they snagged more beautiful lines above 14 camp. We kept receiving reports of massive winds up high, and sometimes I could hear it roaring off the buttress like a freight train. On May 20th, we got our opening with the weather and packed up supplies to go cache at 17,000 feet. To do this, you head up the incline behind 14 camp and up 800 feet of fixed lines to the top of the West Buttress. At the foot of the fixed lines, it's pretty common for teams to bottleneck as they attach themselves to the ropes and move over the bergschrund. The Navy SEALs became our ever-present companions. Moving up the fixed lines is tedious and slow with a crowd, but the top reveals one of the most stunning views of the trip. You can take in the Peters Glacier on one side, the Kahiltna on the other, and on a good day, the other peaks in the Alaska Range spreading far into the distance.
Yeah. That's a sight.
From here, you progress up the sharp ridge using a running belay system, since there's lots of exposure on both sides. You climb around Washburn's Thumb, a large granite formation, and continue up and around a few hills to get to 17 camp. It was only when I stopped moving that I could tell the air was noticeably thinner, and I also understood why we waited for the right moment to come here. The plateau at 17 camp is a wind-scoured, inhospitable place. We descended back to 14 the way we came. It was back to waiting again. 3 days passed. Too much wind, bad weather, and more foul reports from up high on the radio. To pass the time, we built snow walls around the camp. Though 14 camp gets windy sometimes, we didn't genuinely need them. But it was nice to sink into the rhythms of cutting and hauling snow blocks. It was something to occupy our thoughts. The morning of May 24th, the wind finally calmed. As soon as I heard the stoves fire up sometime around 7 a.m., I knew we were going up. I'd begun an unhealthy pattern where I'd feel extremely energized when we'd move, and then sink into a kind of despair when we'd stop for any length of time. That familiar crunch of the snow as we moved out of camp lifted my spirits. We retraced our steps from the caching run, up the fixed lines, across the ridge, and into 17 camp. The route was pretty crowded with all of the different teams tracking the same weather window. This time at 17 camp, we had to chop out platforms and set up the tents. RMI keeps a cache up there with spades, which made breaking up the wind-hardened snow a lot easier. But doing any kind of labor at this elevation saps your energy very quickly. We each had to take frequent breaks. We were prepared to make our summit bid the next day, but the winds picked up. On May 25th, we just kicked around camp again. I was beside myself in anticipation and fear that the conditions wouldn't give us our chance. We'd come so far. Mike briefed us before we went to bed to be ready to go early the next day. The latest forecast looked good, but the winds really went crazy that night. But somewhere in the wee hours of the morning, the air deadened and it was silent. Mike gave us the signal to start readying around 6 a.m. I'd slept for a total of 2 or 3 hours, but I didn't care at all. I just wanted to get this thing done. We hurried through breakfast, fixed ourselves to our ropes, and then headed toward the Autobahn. It doesn't seem all that bad when you're on it, just a traverse up a high-angle slope. But it's unforgiving. It's easy to see how people underestimate this section, make a mistake, and meet their ends down in the thicket of broken ice below. We crossed Denali Pass, hung a right, and climbed past Zebra Rocks. One member of our party was forced to turn back around 19,000 feet due to altitude sickness and hypothermia. We continued past Archdeacon's Tower to the football field at 19,600. We could see huge clouds of spindrift rocketing off the summit ridge above. On a break, our guide Jess stressed to us that there was no guarantee we'd be crossing the ridge to the summit. But since we were protected from the prevailing wind by the ridge itself, we were going to climb Pig Hill, the last rise, and see how the conditions looked at that point. We gained the summit ridge. As if by magic, the wind ceased. We decided to continue across the last segment of the route to the summit.
Okay. I think it'll be better to just sit here.
I didn't really feel the significance of the moment on the tallest point on the mountain, which is also the tallest point in North America. I was more focused on the altitude, the cold, and my own exhaustion. But I burst into tears when we got back down to the football field, and it all hit me. Not only was that success the culmination of 20 days on the mountain, and a lot of suffering to that point, it fulfilled an ambition I'd set out 2 years earlier. Ever since that pivotal experience I had on the Grand Teton, Denali was almost constantly on my mind. I felt immense gratitude toward everyone who'd helped me get to that point. The guides, my family, and my friends. It's still unreal to me that it's done. After 20 days to get to the summit, it took us 2 days to get back down to base camp from 17,000 feet. They were some of the most harrowing of the trip, though.
Climbing. Anchor. Okay. How's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good, yeah.
Back down?
Yeah.
Welcome home.
Good time.
Hauling my gear from 14,000 feet to 11,000 feet was incredibly taxing. My pack was so hideously overloaded. Then, from 11,000 feet, we hauled sleds downhill through the middle of the night across the Kahiltna to cross the snow bridges while they were frozen and strong. We were hoping for the beautiful alpenglow, but we were mostly socked in by low-hanging clouds. I can only describe this part of the climb as mirthless toil. When we arrived at Heartbreak Hill, named so for being the final uphill segment of the climb before the airstrip, I felt nothing but excitement for my cache of whiskey at the top. It's rare to find something as acutely aggravating as managing a loaded sled on the downhill. The PVC pipe rig I used to keep it behind me kept breaking and malfunctioning, so that the whole apparatus would swing out in front and cut across my path. I was at the end of my tether and just left it in its mangled state for the last 2 hours of our return.
Thank you.
Back at base camp, we finally relaxed, and the exhaustion of the past week settled over me. It was 9 a.m., but we all took pulls from the booze we brought and waited for our planes.
Oh yeah, you're good, man.
Your favorite drink?
Fortunately, the weather cleared fast, and the familiar red otters of K2 Aviation swept us back to Talkeetna.
I'll take some CMCs and bring like.
When we landed, we all took our shoes off to walk in the grass. I marveled at the trees, the sounds of birds, and the warmth of the air. After a long shower, I closed out my time in Talkeetna with a final night out on the town. I ate 2 dinners. We also stopped in for an obligatory drink, or 5, at the Fairview Inn, which is the traditional town watering hole for climbers and aviators. I've been planning for and thinking about Denali for so long. I'm grateful to have spent so much time with the mountain, to have been there with a good crew, and to have reached the top safely. Only days after we flew off the glacier, members of a Malaysian team were stranded below the summit for 4 days. One of them died while awaiting rescue, and the other 2 were subjected to severe frostbite. It's a strange feeling to have the climb in the rearview mirror. There's a kind of fallout in your life after a big experience like this, and I think it's going to take a while just to settle back into normal routines and to figure out what's next. Until then, I'm planning to enjoy time with my family and on-demand hot water.